Hi everyone, my name is Priyanka Nanayakkara and I'm a PhD candidate at Northwestern University in Computer Science and Communication. Today I'm excited to present to you all, on behalf of myself and my collaborators on our work, what are the chances explaining the Epsilon parameter in differential privacy. So in this work, we focus on the end user. This is the person contributing their data or deciding whether to contribute their data. And specifically, we develop explanations of differential privacy guarantees to help them make more informed data sharing decisions. Differential privacy is a mathematical definition of privacy which organizations across industry and government are increasingly using to protect people's data. In particular, differential privacy provides an individual-level privacy guarantee. So if we conduct an analysis under DP, then whether or not we include any particular individual's information, we expect the outputs to be similar. How similar is determined by Epsilon, which is set by the organization deploying differential privacy. So in short, Epsilon, the privacy loss parameter, controls the strength of privacy protection. Larger Epsilon values correspond to weaker privacy protections. And so hence it's easy to see why end users need information about Epsilon when they're deciding whether to share their data. In fact, Epsilon is so crucial in differential privacy deployments that Dwork et al. Proposed an Epsilon registry, where organizations could make details around their deployments, including Epsilon, public. An Epsilon registry would improve public accountability, and it would allow end users to identify whether organizations are using meaningless or very weak Epsilons. But in order to realize that goal, the registry would need to also include explanations of how to interpret Epsilon. Okay, so currently, explanations being used in real-world settings look something like this. So I'll give you a few seconds to read through this. Okay, so as you might have noticed, that description didn't contain any explicit Epsilon information. So explaining Epsilon is important, but it's not without its challenges. First of all, Epsilon is a unitless and contextless parameter, so saying that we used an Epsilon of 1 versus 17 doesn't mean much on its own to an end user. And second, differential privacy's guarantees are probabilistic. So we can't say for sure that someone's privacy is completely protected or not, and we have to describe some in between in the form of probabilities. But probabilities are notoriously hard for people to reason about. So our goal in this work was to overcome these challenges and develop effective explanation methods for Epsilon that empower end users to make more informed data sharing decisions. And by effective, we mean that our explanations should increase people's objective risk comprehension. So in other words, people should understand the probabilistic nature of guarantees. Second, explanations should improve subjective privacy understanding, so people's feelings that they understood the privacy protections. So if people feel like they understand the protections, and they actually understand the protections, then they can act on that understanding. And last, explanations should improve self-efficacy, specifically confidence in making a data sharing decision and feelings of having enough information to make that decision. So with these goals in mind, we developed 3 portable explanation methods for Epsilon that can be used in a variety of deployments. And so specifically, we designed an odds-based text method, an odds-based visual method, and an example-based method. And so I'm going to go through each of these individually. So first, our odds-based text method presents 2 probabilities. First, the probability of a negative outcome or an inappropriate data leak if the individual does not share their data. And second, the probability of a negative outcome if the individual does share their data. So we intentionally show probabilities corresponding to immediate decisions people can actually make, sharing their data versus not sharing their data. So at the point where an end user is deciding whether to share their information, they often aren't in a position to make the organization apply differential privacy. So instead of showing probabilities corresponding to whether differential privacy is used versus not used, we take a departure from prior work, and we show probabilities related to actions an end user can take, whether to share their data or not. We also frame probabilities as frequencies instead of percentages. So we would say 5 out of 100 versus 5%, because research has found this framing helps people reason about probabilities more effectively. Okay, so second, we have our odds-based visual method. This is an adaptation of our odds-based text method. Here we show the same text as before, but we also visualize the probabilities as icon arrays. So icon arrays are a frequency-framed method of visualizing probabilities, and they've been shown to potentially help people with low numeracy skills better reason under uncertainty. So the idea here is that each icon represents a possible output, and those that are colored in blue or orange are outputs that would lead to a negative outcome. We also intend for the icon arrays to make the idea concrete that there can be several potential outputs, but only one will be realized. Last is the example-based method. So here we draw on findings in usability that suggest concrete examples help people comprehend security and privacy topics. In this method, we show DP outputs again if the end user is to not share their data versus if they do share their data. And so in this way, they can get a sense of how much their data will impact the output and also a sense of the strength of the privacy protections. So in particular, they can look at whether the potential outputs, what they look like when they don't share their data versus when they do. So in evaluating our explanations to see whether or not they're any good, we return to what we earlier defined as a good explanation. So a good explanation should, 1, increase objective risk comprehension, 2, increase subjective privacy understanding, and 3, increase self-efficacy. In our evaluation, we also wanted to study how our methods impact willingness to share data. So we don't include willingness to share data in our evaluation criteria because an effective explanation doesn't necessarily increase or decrease willingness to share, but we still wanted to know whether our explanations had any effect on it. So we conducted a between subjects vignette survey study where we asked participants to imagine themselves in a workplace scenario where they had to make a data sharing decision about some personal information. We designed the scenario to mimic real-world settings. We also explained to them that they were worried that their manager would discover their information based on aggregate results across the company. And we tested 2 scenarios. So one where data sharing was mandatory, but participants had the option of responding truthfully or providing false data. And one where data sharing was optional. So participants could choose between responding truthfully or not responding at all. At a high level, participants first read the scenario, then they saw an explanation of privacy protections, then they made their data sharing decision, and then finally we asked them to answer some follow-up questions. So I'm going to focus on these 3 middle steps in a little bit more detail now. So right after reading the scenario, participants were shown one of our explanation methods instantiated in the fictional workplace setting under one of 4 privacy loss budgets. And so we chose these epsilons to represent a range of protections from very strong to very weak. We then calculated probabilities for the odds-based method we basically modeled a Bayesian adversary, and we made some worst-case assumptions about the adversary's priors. So I can share some more details about that offline, but for the interest of time, I'll keep moving. So we had 2 control groups who saw the deterministic control and the Strong et al. Control, respectively. And so the deterministic control was a no privacy control, so no privacy protections were offered here. And in this case, there was a deterministic outcome. So if participants chose to share their data, a negative outcome would definitely occur. And if they chose to not share their data, then a negative outcome would definitely not occur. And so we expected this to be the easiest setting for participants to reason about in terms of objective risk, because there are no probabilities, basically. And the Strong et al. Control was adapted from a state-of-the-art prior work explanation of differential privacy that does not include any explicit epsilon information. So after seeing the explanation of epsilon or a control, participants made a data sharing decision and they explained why. So we asked this question right after the scenario and explanation so that we could get an initial reaction without priming participants with our later follow-up questions. Next, they answered 2 true-false questions assessing their objective risk comprehension. So both these questions had ground truth answers. And then we asked them to rate their subjective privacy understanding and self-efficacy. So what did we find from this survey? Let's first compare our explanations to one another. Out of our 3 explanation methods, which was most effective? So in general, we found that our odds-based methods were more effective than the example-based method. In particular, both of our odds-based methods improved objective risk comprehension, subjective privacy understanding, and feelings of having enough information to make a data sharing decision over the example-based method. We can also compare our methods to the deterministic control. So this was the control we expected participants to have the easiest time answering objective risk comprehension questions with. our odds-based visual method had a significant positive effect on objective risk comprehension compared to this control. And we found that our example-based method actually had a negative significant effect. And we didn't find a significant effect of our odds-based text method on objective risk comprehension. So compared to the Strong et al. Control, and again, this was the control with the description of differential privacy without explicit epsilon information, our odds-based methods improved feelings of having enough information to make a data sharing decision. So it seems like people appreciate having this explicit epsilon information. And last, let's take a look at willingness to share data. So we found that all three of our explanation methods increased willingness to share data compared to the control with no epsilon information. And we also found that people are sensitive to changes in epsilon. So as we weakened privacy protections, people were less likely to share their data. And you can see this especially with the odds-based visual method. And so the way to read this is the x-axis is that privacy loss budget. So as we move to the right, we have weaker privacy protections. And then the y-axis is showing us proportion of willingness to share data. So you can see as we're weakening the privacy protections, that proportion is going down, especially for that odds-based visual method. Okay, last I'm going to end with some takeaways. So first, we found that our odds-based methods are promising for explaining epsilon to end users. Second, explanations should endeavor to include epsilon information since we found it seems to support self-efficacy, specifically in terms of feeling like you have enough information to make a decision. Third, people's willingness to share data is sensitive to changes in epsilon. And last, explanations like ours can support auditing and public deliberation over differential privacy deployments. And as future work, we think it would be useful to explain impacts of epsilon on accuracy and utility. So I didn't get a chance to mention this, but in some of our qualitative results, people were asking about basically the utility implications of epsilon. And last, we think it would be useful to port our explanations into real-world settings and to create developer tools so that organizations using DP can quickly generate these explanations of epsilon. Okay, I will end with that, and I'm really happy to answer any questions either here or offline. Thanks a lot.